The desert wind whispers secrets across ancient sands, carrying echoes of a truth long buried, a story deliberately erased. For nearly 2 millennia, the world has known one version of the Christian narrative, a tapestry woven with threads of dogma and tradition, carefully curated by those who sought to define the divine. But what if the most profound revelations, the most transformative insights, were not only hidden from view, but actively suppressed, their very existence deemed a threat to the established order? What if the voices that held the deepest understanding of Jesus' message were systematically silenced, their wisdom deemed too dangerous, too radical, too feminine for the world to bear? Imagine a time when the spiritual landscape was not a monolithic structure, but a vibrant, chaotic marketplace of ideas. In the tumultuous crucible of the first century, amidst the Roman Empire's iron grip and the fervent hopes of a new age, a figure emerged who would forever alter the course of human history: Jesus of Nazareth. But the Jesus we think we know, the one enshrined in stained glass and solemn hymns, might be only a shadow of the true teacher, a carefully edited version of a revolutionary mystic. His message, far from being a simple call to faith, was a profound invitation to gnosis, a direct, intuitive knowing of the divine within, a spark of the infinite residing in every human soul. This was a time of spiritual ferment where countless interpretations of Jesus' life and teachings flourished. There were those who saw him as a messianic king, others as a prophet, still others as a divine being. But among them were the Gnostics, a diverse group of seekers who understood Jesus not merely as a savior who died for sins, but as a revealer of hidden knowledge, a guide who illuminated the path to self-discovery and spiritual liberation. For them, salvation wasn't about adherence to external laws or rituals, but about an inner awakening, a recognition of one's true, divine nature. This was a radical departure from the emerging Orthodox view, which increasingly emphasized external authority, hierarchical structures, and a singular, prescribed path to God. The very notion of gnosis challenged the burgeoning power structures of the early church. If salvation came from within, through direct experience and personal revelation, what need was there for priests, bishops, or intermediaries? This fundamental divergence set the stage for a conflict that would rage for centuries, a battle not just for theological supremacy, but for the very soul of Christianity. And at the heart of this conflict lay a truth so unsettling, so subversive, that it had to be buried: the profound and central role of women in Jesus' inner circle, particularly one figure whose wisdom and understanding surpassed even that of his male disciples. For nearly 2 millennia, this alternative narrative remained largely confined to whispers, to fragments of ancient texts dismissed as heresy, to the dusty shelves of forgotten libraries. Then, in 1945, a discovery in the Egyptian desert shattered the silence. Near the town of Nag Hammadi, a collection of 13 ancient codices, bound in leather, was unearthed. These were not the familiar Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These were texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and most startlingly, the Gospel of Mary. These were the voices of the Gnostics, texts that had been deliberately hidden, buried in jars to protect them from destruction by those who sought to enforce a singular, uniform version of Christian truth. The unearthing of these texts was more than an archaeological find. It was a spiritual earthquake. It revealed a vibrant, diverse early Christianity, one where the divine feminine held a place of honor, where spiritual authority was not confined to a select few, and where the path to enlightenment was deeply personal and experiential. These texts spoke of a Jesus who engaged in intimate, esoteric dialogues with his disciples, revealing mysteries of the cosmos and the human soul. And repeatedly, they highlighted one disciple above all others, a woman who understood his teachings with a depth that eluded even his closest male followers. Mary Magdalene. In the traditional narrative, Mary Magdalene is often relegated to the periphery, a repentant sinner, a footnote in the grand story. But the Gnostic texts paint a radically different portrait. Here, she is not merely a follower, but a confidant, a spiritual equal, the apostle to the apostles. She is the one to whom Jesus entrusted his most profound secrets, the one who truly grasped the essence of his Gnostic message. Her understanding was so profound, her connection to Jesus so intimate, that it sparked jealousy and resentment among the male disciples, particularly Peter, who struggled to accept a woman's spiritual authority. This tension, vividly depicted in texts like the Gospel of Mary, reveals the nascent struggle for power and interpretation that would ultimately shape the future of Christianity. The central conflict, then, is laid bare: the struggle between a burgeoning institutional church seeking to consolidate power and define a singular dogmatic truth, and the Gnostic vision, which championed individual spiritual experience, direct revelation, and the inherent divinity within all beings, regardless of gender. The suppression of the Gnostic texts, and with them, a marginalization of figures like Mary Magdalene, was not merely a theological dispute. It was a deliberate act of historical erasure, a systematic attempt to silence voices that threatened the patriarchal structures of the emerging religious establishment. The hidden female disciples, those who truly understood the esoteric mysteries of Jesus, became casualties in this war for the narrative, their wisdom deemed too dangerous to be remembered. But the desert, in its infinite wisdom, held on to their story, preserving it for a time when humanity might finally be ready to hear it. And now the sands have shifted, and the whispers of a forgotten truth are growing louder, inviting us to reconsider everything we thought we knew. The desert, indeed, had its secrets. For over 15 centuries, the jar lay undisturbed, a silent sentinel guarding a truth deemed too potent, too revolutionary for the world. When it was finally unearthed, not by archaeologists, but by a local peasant, the dust of ages clinging to its clay, no one could have foreseen the seismic shift it would unleash in our understanding of early Christianity. Inside, 13 leather-bound codices, fragile and ancient, contained texts that had been meticulously copied and then hidden away, perhaps by monks who knew their value, or by Gnostics who feared their destruction. These were not the Gospels we read in churches, but a library of forgotten wisdom, a direct challenge to the carefully constructed narrative that had dominated Western thought for so long. Among these unearthed treasures were texts like the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of Jesus' sayings, many of which echoed familiar parables, but often carried a deeper, more esoteric meaning. Then there was the Gospel of Philip, which spoke of sacred rituals and intimate relationships, hinting at a profound spiritual partnership between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But perhaps the most electrifying was the Gospel of Mary, a text that placed Mary Magdalene at the very center of the post-resurrection narrative, depicting her as the primary recipient of Jesus' most profound revelations, a figure of unparalleled spiritual authority. The scholarly world, initially stunned, was then forced to confront a radical possibility. What if the story we knew was incomplete, deliberately truncated, missing its most vital voices? This was the Gnostic context of Jesus, a vision far removed from the traditional image of a simple carpenter-turned-preacher. For the Gnostics, Jesus was not merely a historical figure, but a cosmic revealer, a divine emissary sent from the true, transcendent God to awaken humanity from its slumber. He was a master of mysteries, speaking in parables not to simplify, but to conceal deeper truths from those unprepared to receive them, while simultaneously illuminating the path for those with ears to hear. His teachings, as revealed in these rediscovered texts, were less about moral commandments and more about existential questions: the nature of reality, the origin of evil, the spark of divinity within each individual, and the journey back to the ultimate source. He taught that the material world, far from being God's perfect creation, was a flawed construct, a prison of illusion created by a lesser, ignorant deity, the demiurge. True liberation, therefore, lay not in adhering to external laws, but in recognizing and transcending this illusion through gnosis, a direct experiential knowledge of one's true divine self. And who were the unexpected disciples who truly grasped these profound teachings? While the canonical Gospels focus primarily on the 12 male apostles, the Gnostic texts reveal a more diverse and, crucially, more inclusive circle. Women played a prominent, often leading, role. They were not merely passive followers or benefactors, but active participants in the spiritual journey, seekers of wisdom in their own right. Among them, one figure shines with unparalleled brilliance: Mary Magdalene. In the traditional narrative, Mary Magdalene is often introduced as a woman from whom 7 demons were cast out, a vague reference that has, over centuries, been misinterpreted and conflated with other biblical figures to paint her as a repentant prostitute. This characterization, however, finds no direct support in the canonical Gospels themselves and is entirely absent from the Gnostic texts. Instead, the Gnostic Gospels present her as a woman of profound spiritual insight, a close companion, and the most beloved disciple of Jesus. She is depicted as the one who understood his esoteric teachings more deeply than any other, the one to whom he revealed his most intimate secrets. Consider the Gospel of Philip, which explicitly states, "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene." But Christ loved her more than all the disciples, and used to kiss her often on her mouth. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" This passage, shocking to modern sensibilities accustomed to a desexualized Jesus, speaks not of romantic love in the conventional sense, but of a profound spiritual intimacy, a sharing of divine knowledge through direct communion. The kiss on the mouth is a metaphor for the transmission of wisdom, a direct infusion of gnosis from teacher to student. It signifies a bond of understanding and spiritual resonance that transcended the ordinary. This profound connection, however, was not without its challenges. The very intimacy and depth of understanding shared between Jesus and Mary Magdalene became the initial seed of conflict within the nascent community. The male disciples, particularly Peter, struggled with her prominence. They saw her as an outsider, a woman whose spiritual authority threatened their own emerging leadership roles. The Gospel of Mary vividly captures this tension. After Jesus' departure, Mary Magdalene shares visions and teachings that Jesus had revealed to her alone. Andrew questions her, saying, "Speak what you have to say concerning what he said, for we will not believe you, for he did not speak these things to us, but to you." Peter, even more vehemently, declares, "Did he really speak with a woman in private, without our knowing it? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" This was more than mere jealousy. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews. Peter and others represented a more patriarchal, hierarchical understanding of spiritual authority, one that would eventually solidify into the institutional church. They believed that leadership and revelation should flow through a male lineage, sanctioned by tradition. Mary Magdalene, on the other hand, embodied a different path, one where spiritual insight was earned through direct experience and inner understanding, where gender was irrelevant to one's capacity for gnosis. Her very presence, her profound wisdom, and Jesus' clear preference for her understanding challenged the emerging power dynamics. This initial friction, this subtle but potent resentment, was the first tremor of a schism that would ultimately lead to the systematic marginalization of women in Christian leadership and the suppression of the very texts that celebrated their spiritual power. The stage was set for a battle over narrative, over authority, and over the very essence of what it meant to follow Jesus. And in this battle, the voices of the hidden female disciples would be the first casualties. The tension within Jesus' inner circle, so vividly captured in the Gnostic texts, was not merely a personal squabble between disciples. It was a microcosm of a much larger, cosmic drama, a theological battle for the very soul of humanity's understanding of the divine. At its heart lay the concept of the feminine principle, a sacred force that the Gnostics held in the highest esteem, yet one that the burgeoning Orthodox movement sought to systematically diminish and ultimately erase. In Gnostics, the divine was not exclusively masculine. Far from it. They spoke of Sophia, a Greek word meaning wisdom, as a central, feminine emanation of the ultimate, transcendent God. Sophia was not merely an abstract concept. She was a divine personification, a cosmic mother, a creative force intimately involved in the unfolding of existence. In some Gnostic myths, Sophia, in her yearning to know the unknowable God, inadvertently brought forth the material world and its flawed creator, the demiurge, a lesser ignorant deity who mistakenly believed himself to be the one true God. This act, often seen as a fall, was also an act of profound love and longing, scattering sparks of divine light, or gnosis, throughout the material realm, trapped within human souls. His Gnostic cosmology offered a radical departure from the more prevailing narratives. It posited that the true God was beyond human comprehension, a boundless light, and that the world we inhabit was not a perfect creation, but a realm of illusion and suffering, ruled by a blind and arrogant lesser God. Salvation, therefore, was not about appeasing this demiurge or adhering to his laws, but about awakening the divine spark within, recognizing one's true origin, and ascending back to the pleroma, the fullness of the divine realm. And in this journey of awakening, Sophia, the divine wisdom, played a crucial role, often guiding humanity back to its true source. It is within this profound Gnostic framework that the significance of Mary Magdalene truly blossoms. She was not just a favored student. She was seen by many Gnostics as the embodiment of Sophia herself, the living vessel of divine wisdom. Her profound understanding of Jesus' esoteric teachings, her ability to grasp the deeper hidden meanings behind his parables, was not merely intellectual acumen. It was a reflection of her intrinsic connection to the divine feminine, a resonance with the very essence of Sophia. When Jesus shared his most profound secrets with her, when he kissed her often on her mouth, a symbolic act of transmitting gnosis, he was not just teaching a disciple. He was communing with the living embodiment of divine wisdom. This understanding of Mary Magdalene as Sophia incarnate was a direct threat to the emerging patriarchal structure of the Church. If a woman could embody divine wisdom, if she could receive direct revelation from the Christ, and if her understanding surpassed that of the male apostles, then the very foundation of a male-dominated hierarchy crumbled. The idea that spiritual authority could flow through a woman, that the path to God was not exclusively mediated by male priests or bishops, was anathema to those consolidating power. The struggle between Peter and Mary Magdalene, as depicted in the Gospel of Mary, becomes more than a personal rivalry. It becomes a symbolic clash between two opposing visions of Christianity. Peter, representing the emerging institutional authority, emphasizes external order, adherence to rules, and a structured leadership. Mary Magdalene, representing the Gnostic path, champions inner experience, direct revelation, and the inherent spiritual equality of all, regardless of gender. When Peter challenges her authority, saying, "Did he really speak with a woman in private without our knowing it? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" He is not just expressing jealousy. He is articulating the fear of a paradigm shift, a world where the feminine divine and women themselves hold spiritual power. This fear was not unfounded. The Gnostic movement, with its emphasis on individual experience, its diverse interpretations, and its prominent role for women, was inherently decentralized and resistant to hierarchical control. It celebrated a spiritual democracy where every soul had the potential for direct communion with the divine. This stood in stark contrast to the burgeoning Orthodox movement, which sought to establish a unified doctrine, a singular authority, and a clear chain of command, all of which were predominantly male. The systematic marginalization of Mary Magdalene, her transformation from apostle to the apostles to a repentant sinner, was a crucial step in this process. By demonizing her, by stripping her of her spiritual authority and associating her with sin, the Orthodox Church effectively silenced the most powerful female voice in early Christianity. This act was not isolated. It was part of a broader campaign to suppress the feminine principle within the divine itself. Sophia, the divine wisdom, was gradually replaced by a solely masculine god, and the role of women in spiritual leadership was systematically curtailed. The Gnostic texts, with their radical vision of a divine feminine and empowered female disciples, became dangerous artifacts. They were deemed heretical, their teachings branded as false, and their very existence a threat to the true faith. The burning of Gnostic libraries, the persecution of Gnostic communities, and the deliberate exclusion of their writings from the emerging biblical canon were not accidents of history. They were calculated acts of suppression designed to erase an alternative narrative, to ensure that only one version of Jesus' message and one understanding of the divine would prevail. The great erasure was underway, and with it the voices of the hidden female disciples and the profound wisdom they carried were cast into the shadows, awaiting a time when the sands of history would shift once more. The whispers of dissent, the radical notion of an inner divine spark, and the unsettling prominence of women in spiritual leadership were not merely tolerated by the nascent institutional church. They were seen as an existential threat. As the first centuries of the Common Era unfolded, the battle for the narrative intensified, evolving from theological debate into outright persecution. The Gnostic vision, with its emphasis on individual gnosis and the divine feminine, stood in stark opposition to the emerging Orthodox structure, which championed external authority, hierarchical control, and a predominantly masculine image of God. This was not a gentle parting of ways. It was a brutal campaign of suppression, a deliberate act of historical erasure. The process began subtly, with the condemnation of Gnostic teachings as heresy by influential church fathers. Figures like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Hippolytus wrote extensive polemics, systematically dismantling Gnostic doctrines and portraying their adherents as dangerous deviants. These intellectual attacks laid the groundwork for physical persecution. Gnostic communities, once vibrant centers of spiritual exploration, were branded as enemies of the true faith. Their gatherings were disrupted, their members ostracized, and their sacred texts targeted for destruction. Imagine the fear, the desperation, as scrolls and codices, painstakingly copied and cherished for their profound insights, were hunted down and burned, their wisdom reduced to ash. This systematic destruction was not random. It was a calculated effort to control the narrative, to ensure that only one version of Christian truth would survive. The very act of creating a canon of Scripture, the selection of certain Gospels and letters to be deemed authoritative, was inherently an act of exclusion. The texts that celebrated Mary Magdalene's spiritual authority, that spoke of Sophia as a divine emanation, that presented Jesus as a revealer of hidden knowledge rather than a sacrificial lamb, were deliberately left out. They were deemed apocryphal, spurious, or outright heretical, effectively removing them from the collective memory of what Christianity was meant to be. For centuries, this strategy proved remarkably effective. The Gnostic voices faded into obscurity, their profound insights buried beneath layers of orthodox dogma. The image of Mary Magdalene as a repentant sinner, stripped of her spiritual authority and reduced to a symbol of redemption through penance, became deeply ingrained in Western consciousness. The divine feminine, once a vibrant aspect of early spiritual thought, was relegated to the shadows, replaced by an exclusively patriarchal deity. The world forgot that there had ever been another way, another understanding of Jesus, another role for women in the sacred. The great erasure was complete, or so it seemed. But history, like the desert, has a way of preserving secrets. The very act of suppression, the desperate need to hide these texts from destruction, inadvertently became their salvation. Those who cherished the Gnostic wisdom, knowing the peril they faced, took extraordinary measures to preserve it. They didn't just hide individual scrolls. They buried entire libraries, carefully sealed in jars, hoping that one day, when the intellectual climate had shifted, their profound truths might once again see the light of day. And for over 1,600 years, these buried treasures lay undisturbed, silent witnesses to a forgotten past, awaiting their moment of revelation. That moment arrived in December 1945, in a twist of fate that seems almost divinely orchestrated. A local peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, struck something hard. It was a large red earthenware jar. Fearing it might contain a jinn, a mischievous spirit, he hesitated. But curiosity, or perhaps destiny, prevailed. He smashed the jar, revealing not gold or jewels, but 13 leather-bound papyrus codices. These were the very texts that had been condemned, burned, and forgotten for over a millennium and a half. This accidental discovery, made by a man with no knowledge of ancient history or theology, was a turning point that would irrevocably alter our understanding of early Christianity and the true breadth of Jesus' message. The unearthing of the Nag Hammadi library was nothing short of a spiritual earthquake. When scholars finally began to translate these ancient Coptic texts, they were confronted with a version of Christianity that was startlingly different from the one they knew. Here were Gospels that spoke of Jesus' secret teachings, not just to his inner circle, but specifically to Mary Magdalene. Here were texts that presented a cosmic drama of light and darkness, of divine sparks trapped in material bodies, and of a path to salvation through direct knowledge or gnosis. The very existence of these texts challenged the long-held assumption that the canonical Gospels represented the entirety of early Christian thought. It revealed a vibrant, diverse, and often contradictory spiritual landscape in the centuries immediately following Jesus' life. This rediscovery was a profound revelation, a twist in the historical narrative that forced a re-evaluation of everything. It confirmed what some scholars had long suspected, that the early Christian movement was far more pluralistic than previously imagined, and that the suppression of Gnosticism was not merely a theological debate, but a deliberate act of power. Consolidation. More importantly, it brought the voices of the hidden female disciples, particularly Mary Magdalene, back into the light. Her role as a primary recipient of Jesus' esoteric teachings, her profound spiritual authority, and the challenges she faced from the male apostles were no longer mere speculation, but documented fact. Preserved in her own gospel, the Nag Hammadi discovery was a turning point because it provided irrefutable evidence that an alternative Christian narrative had not only existed, but had flourished. It offered a glimpse into a world where the divine feminine was revered, where individual spiritual experience was paramount, and where the path to God was not mediated solely by a male priesthood. It was a powerful vindication for those who believed that the traditional narrative was incomplete and a profound challenge to the established religious institutions. The sands had indeed shifted, and the whispers of a forgotten truth were no longer just whispers. They were a chorus, rising from the desert, demanding to be heard, inviting us to reconsider the very foundations of our spiritual understanding. The stage was now set for a deeper exploration of these revelations and their profound implications for our modern world. The dust settled, both literally and metaphorically, after the Nag Hammadi discovery. But the true earthquake was not in the unearthing of ancient jars, but in the shattering of long-held assumptions. For centuries, the narrative of early Christianity had been a carefully constructed edifice built upon the 4 canonical Gospels and the writings of the Church Fathers. This edifice presented a singular, unified vision, a male-dominated hierarchy, a singular path to salvation through faith and adherence to dogma, and a Jesus who was primarily a historical figure, a divine sacrifice for humanity's sins. The Gnostic texts, however, blew open the walls of this edifice, revealing a far more complex, diverse, and for many, a far more compelling spiritual landscape. The most profound twist lay in the reimagining of biblical figures, particularly Jesus himself. In the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus is not merely a moral teacher or a sacrificial lamb. He is the ultimate Gnostic revealer, the light of the world in a profoundly esoteric sense. His mission is not to establish a new religion with rigid rules, but to awaken humanity to its true divine nature, to remind souls of their celestial origin and their imprisonment in a material world created by a lesser, ignorant deity. He speaks in riddles and parables, not to simplify, but to veil deeper truths from the uninitiated, while simultaneously illuminating the path for those capable of understanding. His crucifixion, often seen as the central act of redemption in Orthodox theology, is reinterpreted not as a literal sacrifice for sin, but as a symbolic act of transcending the material realm, a demonstration of the Spirit's triumph over the flesh. This radical reinterpretation challenges the very foundation of traditional Christian atonement theology, shifting the focus from external salvation to internal transformation. But perhaps the most startling revelation, the one that truly sent shockwaves through the academic and spiritual worlds, concerned the figure of Mary Magdalene. For nearly 2 millennia, she had been relegated to the shadows, a repentant sinner, a symbol of fallen womanhood redeemed by Christ. Yet, the Gnostic texts present a portrait so utterly different, so profoundly empowering, that it forces a complete re-evaluation of her role, and by extension, the role of women in early Christianity. In the Gospel of Mary, she is not just a follower. She is the one who truly understands Jesus' teachings, the one who comforts the other disciples after his departure, and the one to whom Jesus entrusted his most profound, esoteric wisdom. She is depicted as a visionary, a spiritual leader, and the primary interpreter of Jesus' secret teachings. This portrayal of Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles creates a central moral dilemma and spiritual conflict. If she was indeed Jesus' most insightful disciple, the one who truly grasped his Gnostic message, then her systematic marginalization and vilification by the later church represents not just a historical injustice, but a deliberate suppression of vital spiritual knowledge. It suggests that the patriarchal structures that came to dominate Christianity actively sought to silence the feminine voice, to diminish the role of women in spiritual leadership, and to erase any narrative that challenged their burgeoning authority. The Gnostic texts reveal that this wasn't a passive omission, but an active, conscious choice. The arguments between Peter and Mary Magdalene, so vividly described in the Gospel of Mary, are not just historical anecdotes. They are symbolic of the fundamental clash between 2 competing visions of Christianity. One, hierarchical and male-dominated. The other egalitarian and inclusive of the divine feminine. The implications extend far beyond Mary Magdalene herself. The Gnostic emphasis on Sophia, the divine wisdom, as a feminine aspect of God, challenges the exclusively masculine image of the divine that became prevalent in Orthodox Christianity. This concept of Sophia, often seen as a co-creator or an en fait emanation of the ultimate God, suggests a more balanced, dualistic understanding of the divine, one that embraces both masculine and feminine principles. The suppression of Sophia and the subsequent marginalization of the divine feminine had profound consequences, not just for theology, but for the societal role of women throughout Western history. The Gnostic texts, therefore, offer not just historical insights, but a potential pathway to reclaiming a more holistic and inclusive spirituality. Furthermore, these ancient texts reveal unexpected links to other mystical traditions and esoteric teachings. The Gnostic emphasis on inner knowledge, the journey of the soul, and the concept of a divine spark within each individual resonates with elements found in ancient Egyptian mysteries, Platonic philosophy, and even some Eastern spiritual traditions. This suggests that the Gnostic movement was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader stream of perennial wisdom, a universal quest for direct experience of the divine that transcends specific religious boundaries. The Nag Hammadi Library, therefore, serves as a bridge, connecting early Christianity to a wider tapestry of human spiritual seeking, hinting at a shared esoteric heritage that has often been overlooked or deliberately obscured. The twists and turns revealed by these texts are not merely academic curiosities. They are profound challenges to our understanding of history, religion, and spirituality. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history is often written by the victors, and that vital pieces of the human story can be deliberately suppressed for political or ideological reasons. The rediscovery of the Gnostic Gospels and the re-evaluation of figures like Mary Magdalene are not just about correcting historical inaccuracies. They are about reclaiming lost wisdom, re-evaluating the nature of authority, and opening ourselves to a more expansive, inclusive, and deeply personal understanding of the divine. The climax of this historical narrative is not a single event, but an ongoing process of rediscovery and reinterpretation, inviting us to look beyond the familiar and embrace the profound complexities of our spiritual heritage. The revelations continue to unfold, challenging us to question, to seek, and to ultimately find the hidden truths within ourselves.